Welcome to my Central European talk, Cars for the East. Polish gang stole 60 turbo diesel cars, titled a short article in the Austrian newspaper Kronenzeitung on 8th May 1987. The article was illustrated with three ID photographs, probably they were not mugshots, picturing the alleged gang members, a Polish couple and a single man living in an apartment in Favoriten, the largest district of Vienna that consists primarily of working class neighborhoods. The article provided some additional information in the subheadings. New trick, full cap drilled out, and cars were smuggled to Poland. For Vienna, car gangs were a novelty at the time, and the police were initially at a loss. It was the first major case of organized car traffic into Poland in Austria. In the 1990s, similar cases were to dominate the headlines. The stereotype of the Polish car thief was to shape the image of Poland for a long time to come. In this paper, I will shed light on the background of this phenomenon, which I call here informal car market. The origins lay in the transnational informal markets that strongly characterized the People's Republic of Poland and, of course, other countries in the Eastern Bloc, and in which Vienna played a pivotal role. Here I will focus primarily on the actors. Both arrested men had come to Vienna from Krakow in the late 1870s and early 1980s, respectively. Both had belonged to a specific group. They were racing drivers in the People's Republic of Poland. The transition between racing drivers, mechanics, and co-pilots was fluid. I will take a closer look at the biography, networks, and practices of one of the two men. He was born in the 1940s and died more than a decade ago. I found an obituary when I did a Google search. But nevertheless, I will protect his identity, so he should be called just Wiesław S. This is a pseudonym that has nothing to do with his real name. This is also the procedure for the other persons appearing in the files. Exceptions are only persons who were in the public eye and whose names are important for understanding the context. In my talk, I will use some direct quotations from the sources I use to give you some idea of the specifics of these materials. When I conducted research, first I conducted some research in Austria, then in Poland, at the Institute of National Remembrance, IPN, in Poland, I discovered two files on Wiesław S. He had served as secret collaborator for the security service, or Służba Bezpieczeństwa in Polish, SB. This was the Polish secret police, and from 1975 to 1980, there were 61 meetings with SB officers that were documented by typewritten reports. Wiesław S. reported extensively on his environment, on various persons in his environment, which also leads to several arrests at least. His cryptonym was Rajdowiec, racing driver. At the beginning of Wiesław's personal file, an SB officer compiled a brief characteristic, quote, "He has been involved in motorsport as an amateur for several years and has already participated in several international rallies as a service technician, where he represented West German companies. At the moment, he also has a contract with a car company in West Germany. These contacts were made possible by Sobiesław Zasada. Zasada was a legendary Polish racing driver, maybe the best known of his era. I continue to quote, and Zasada treats him as one of his trusted assistants. His next trip to West Germany is planned for February or March 1975. Um, the way of his recruitment was typical for a Soviet type and probably not only Soviet type secret police. They identified the Achilles heel that would make someone to comply with the security services. In Wiesław's case, the weak spot was his mother, who was running a cafeteria called Zubido, named after the ancient Roman god, in the city of Krakow. She had issued a forged work contract for an acquaintance who had used the document to obtain a passport and then not returned to Poland but stayed in Austria to work there. The SP officer interfered that this was a chance. Again, I quote. As I found out, the above mentioned situation can be used for the acquisition of Wiesław S., as he cares a lot about his mother's peace and wants to shield her from prosecution, which would probably make her financial situation much worse. The choice of Wiesław S. is dictated by his considerable operational capabilities. He has access to an interesting environment from the operational point of view. He constantly moves among people traveling to the capitalist countries, and he himself often travels. He has a business passport. He has contacts in West Germany and Austria. He visited F and L in Vienna and still can visit them. I argue that the milieu of the racing drivers constitute a specific subculture in the People's Republic of Poland. A subculture is defined as an identifiable subgroup within a society or group of people, especially one characterized by beliefs or interests at variance with those of the larger group. A subculture is defined by distinctive ideas, practices, or way of life of such a subgroup. Racing was certainly a strong common interest, distinct from the overall society that united the racing drivers. It is also important to emphasize that racing drivers in Poland in those days were, as a rule, not professionals. Some of them were connected to small private companies or worked in businesses at the intersection of state-owned and private. Wiesław S., who worked in his mother's cafeteria, Zubido, is a good example. When it comes to distinct practices, they had to take care of their cars themselves and provide spare parts, for instance. Within the state socialist system, this was nearly impossible only by legal means. In this context, I refer to the Soviet American economist Aaron Katzenelin-Boygan, who analyzed the market in consumer goods and services in the Soviet Union by speaking of colored markets. While the red market referred to the official but poorly supplied sector, the white market covered used goods, and the gray covered the exchange of services in some kind of barter system. Finally, the brown market includes goods that were theoretically legally available but often unobtainable due to scarcity. Brown market actors were often tolerated by the authorities, but not always. For instance, when stolen goods were involved. The concept of colored markets, as described by Katzenelin-Boygan, can be also applied to socialist Poland. As historian Jerzy Kochanowski, the leading expert in black markets and all kind of informal economy in Poland, points out, I quote, a separate segment of the brown market was constituted by imported luxury goods. From the Soviet perspective, there were luxury goods, mostly clothing in the 1980s, among others, video cassettes or even cars. They were imported in considerable quantities, often legally, by sailors, athletes, artists. The racing drivers were also a group whose most important asset was their ability to travel abroad. The private import of cars or car parts, as well as various appurtenances, which appeared as a mass phenomenon in the 1980s. In this context, I mentioned at the beginning that the case in Vienna began much earlier for the racing drivers, already in the 1960s and 1970s. They were organized in a multitude of formal and informal ways, and I will take a closer look at the group of racers in Krakow that is covered by the reports of Wiesław S. I will analyze their activities in informal markets. I will ask about their practices, the goods they traded in, and the structure of their networks. In doing so, I will shed light on four spatial dimensions of these networks: Krakow, Warsaw, other Eastern Bloc countries, and finally Vienna. Let's start with Krakow. The Krakowian racing drivers were constant guests at the Café Milano. It was certainly the most important space of communication. And the majority of conversations Wiesław S. reported to the secret police had taken place there. Rumors were exchanged and business plans were made, and when the first arrests began, there was a speculation about the reasons. The Café Milano was located in an completely unspectacular building. I found a picture online on Praska Street in the outskirts of the city on the other side of the Vistula River, and it had nothing at all to do with the Viennese-themed coffee shops in the historical city centers that we would visit today in Krakow. But what the Café Milano had to offer was much more attractive than architecture and tradition, I quote. It was the second private cafe in Krakow at that time, in the late 1960s. The son worked behind the buffet, the daughter was a waitress, the wife supervised the kitchen and her baked goods, especially cakes, which were famous even in Warsaw. The Café Milano became a mecca, not only for Krakowian artists. The private cafe also attracted guests from abroad, and almost as a matter of course, it became a place for foreign currency transactions, as Wiesław S. reported. At Brzezinski's Café Milano, various foreign exchange transactions are arranged with foreigners arriving there, who go directly to Andrzej Brzezinski, that's the son of the owner, and sell foreign currency to him. On 25 July this year, he bought for 20,000 zlotys, Italian lira. Later, another meeting place appeared in Krakow when two racing drivers opened up their own card parlor called Tic Tac. They had imported pinball machines from the West. Wiesław S. reported in detail on this enterprise and suspected that the machines were manipulated in order to illegally withdraw money. At the same time, the parlor became another important venue of trade in foreign currency. Again, quote, "As far as I know, B," that was one of the racing drivers that had opened up a card. So B, I suppose that he can make various illegal transactions of foreign currency with foreigners who will come to the above-mentioned premises. Here again, the importance of such meeting places as some kind of exchange offices are very clear, and the racing drivers, even without traveling, could make foreign currency transactions there. Warsaw. Of great importance for the Krakowians were contact with racers in Warsaw, whom they met at racing events in Poland and abroad. They became important partners in informal trading activities, as Wiesław S. stated in one of his reports. It was not only about cars and especially coveted car appurtenances, but also about other things that were traded as important luxury goods, as Jerzy Kochanowski called it, in the brown market, especially clothes of Western production. In the reports of Wiesław S., there are several examples, and I will quote some of them to give you an idea of this trade between Krakow and Warsaw. Quote, "Currently, as far as I know, he, that is one of the racing drivers in Krakow, he trades in jackets, calendars, castrol, and car parts. He has business contacts with residents of Warsaw, and these are FK, who is a Castrol representative, and Xavier Frank, the owner of a car repair shop. Unquote. The next example, I quote. During the meeting, the circuit collaborator, so he talks of himself in the third person here. So during the meeting, the circuit collaborator conveyed that lately B is engaged in the trade of nylon jackets. These jackets advertised the well-known company Castrol. They were sent to Poland as duty-free goods in a quantity of at least 1,000 pieces. The representative of this company in Warsaw is Mr. F. B probably received 50 such jackets from him, which he sells in Krakow for about 3,500 zloty per piece. It is forbidden to sell advertising materials, which B is well aware of, as well as Mr. F, who surely derives some profit from these transactions. The last example. Recently, I found out that B and L trade in stereos made by a Japanese company for cars, which they bought in Warsaw at 3,800 zloty a piece and sell them in Krakow. They sell them for 6,000 to 7,000 zlotys a piece. It is clear from these examples that there was a kind of patron-client relationship between the Warsawian and the Krakowian. The Warsawians were better connected, they had preferential access to resources, and they received a share of the profits from the Krakowians' activities. Many of the Warsaw racers mentioned in the files were significantly older and more experienced than the ones from Krakow. The above-mentioned Xavier Frank, for instance, had participated in the Warsaw Uprising in 1944 as a young man, and he had been involved in the semi-legal or illegal import of Western vehicles into Poland as early as the early 1960s or even late 1950s. Incidentally, the group of Warsaw racers also included Andrzej Jaroszewicz, the son of the Polish Prime Minister. So you see that that they were very well connected to the higher spheres of the administration, and this is why the contacts to Warsaw were also instrumental in obtaining a passport. So in order to get a passport application get it approved, and here I have another example. From Wiesław S. reports, I quote, in a conversation with me, B, that's the guy who traded in Castrol jackets, so B boasted that he had extensive contacts in the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Warsaw and therefore would have no difficulty in obtaining a passport for further travels abroad. What were these travels abroad? Where would they go? First, I will elaborate a little bit on travel inside the Eastern Bloc. The Krakow racing drivers would travel, for example, to Hungary, to Czechoslovakia, and to Romania. In the files of Wiesław S., there is a report about the rally in Prague in 1976, I quote. We are in the possession of information which indicates that B, together with his acquaintances L, W, and G, going on a car rally to Czechoslovakia at the end of March, transported 126 car tires across the border of the People's Republic of Poland on the basis of falsified permits. They sold the tires in Hungary, where S has a permanent acquaintance. B has a permanent acquaintance. Then, with the money he received, B bought 32 to 35 forints for $1. On the 1st of October 1976, the aforementioned returned to Budapest, carrying with them about $2,000, which they obtained from the sale of the tires. Of this, B received the sum of $700 as the main organizer of the sale of tires and the purchase of dollars. W received $300 and L received $1,000 because he financed the entire venture. The above-mentioned tires are purchased at GS stores. That was common, the most common chain of stores in rural Poland. So in GS stores in and around Krakow for an appropriate bribe depending on the number of tires purchased, unquote. Analyzing these examples, this example of the tires, it becomes very clear that the role of racing drivers, their identity of racing drivers, was the prerequisite for the trading activities. They had privileged access to these resources, coveted because scarce commodity in the Eastern Bloc. So, for example, car tires were always very popular. Even in the 1980s, they were often stolen and sold at the brown or black market, as you want to call it. And what is also very important here is that they were able to make at least officially credible why they would need tires for the rally in Prague, spare tires. The sporting event was merely the occasion that took a backseat to the business. VSFS reported that after the tire deal, his two colleagues were no longer admitted to the rally when they arrived finally in Prague, but they had already achieved their goal. Not coincidentally, the transaction and the subsequent exchange of money from Hungarian forints into American dollars took place in Budapest in a hotel, as VSFS recounted, quote, "Moreover, B has an acquaintance in the Budapest hotel Ifjúság, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, which means youth, and B mediates in various business transactions, mostly in the purchase of dollars from people of foreign origin. As far as I know, the main supplier is an Italian citizen." The outstanding role of Budapest for this type of currency transaction is also stressed by Jerzy Kochanowski. I quote, "The closest contacts were established in Budapest, which already in the 1970s was a traditional smuggling and transit center where the interests of criminals organizing international smuggling from Arab countries, Yugoslavia, Austria, Italy, and West Germany intersect. Poles, however, did not constitute a dominant group among them, usually acting as middlemen and small recipients of smuggling. That was exactly the role that the racing car drivers played here when they sold the tires and bought foreign currency in Budapest. But finally, the question is, how does Vienna come into the picture? The Austrian capital, together with West Berlin and port cities such as Hamburg or Antwerp, was one of the centers of informal trade between East and West. In the case of Vienna, the fact that the city had been divided into 4 occupation zones, 4 sectors, until 1955 certainly played a role. And even there had been informal trade involving Allied soldiers. After that, Vienna became the first stop for many refugees and migrants from the Eastern Bloc, even if most of them did not settle permanently in Austria. Nevertheless, there was a small but lively Polish diaspora in Vienna, a Polish diaspora community, which the Krakow racing drivers were also able to rely on. VSFS himself also had a multitude of contacts in Austria. His brother worked at the first steel mills in Linz, Upper Austria, for some time, and later left for the United States. During his frequent trips to Vienna, VSFS met various other acquaintances from Poland, among others in a coffee house on Stephansplatz, St. Stephen's Square. And he made no distinction whether they were refugees or not. Maybe he didn't even know it exactly. He also had contacts with a Polish family that had been in Vienna for some time on a consular passport. They were close friends of his fiancée's brother. VSFS attested that the son of the family had a positive relationship with the People's Republic of Poland, and so he was given the task of recruiting the young man. I didn't investigate this case further, but that was also one of his tasks. He should recruit new secret collaborators in order to supervise the Polish community in Vienna. One of Westwärts' acquaintances in Vienna was a former racing driver, Zbigniew N. He must have known him from Krakow because Zbigniew N had participated in a number of rallies in the 1960s. Wiesow explained that N was a Pole who left Austria in 1970 as a result of debts and stayed there. In Poland, he owned a private company. Wiesow assumed that Sobiesław Zasada, the aforementioned legendary racing driver, would do business with Zbigniew N. Quote, "Having been to this place several times, I noticed that very often there are citizens of the People's Republic of Poland, and these are Sobiesław Zasada, who is connected with N in some way and probably related to automotive services. I also noticed that Zasada usually talked to him in private, but I don't know what they talked about. N also maintained contact with Andrzej E. He is currently trying to rent a car from the West German company Opel through N. He intends to compete in rallies with this car. As far as I know, N repeatedly helped Polish competitors in terms of contacts with car companies in capitalist countries, BMW, Opel, Castrol. N is associated with many influential people in the West representing the car industry." Unquote. But what was really exceptional about Vienna, apart from all these contacts and the racing driver who supplied them with various spare parts and even contacts to car companies, what was really exceptional about Vienna were the markets, which attracted droves of Polish tourists, as the historian Dariusz Stolar described, quote, "The Ministry of the Interior lamented that contrary to its recommendations, the pursuit of profit overshadowed the problem of participant selection among travelers, as there was too much speculative element. Over time, travel agencies began to offer tours whose commercial character was almost overt, only slightly masked by the shortened tourist program. In particular, trips to Austria, Vienna, and Turkey were famous for this, lasting little longer than the time needed to make the intended transactions. It is not without reason that in the second half of the 1970s, these two countries came to the forefront of group travel statistics." Unquote. According to the sociologist Roland Girtler, a legendary expert in the Austrian underworld and various informal businesses, Vienna's attractiveness to travelers from the Eastern Bloc had its origin right on St. Stephen's Square in the very heart of the city. Quote, "In the 50s, the Hungarian refugee, E.D., looking for an opportunity to earn money, had opened a small store with special goods. He offered things that were not produced in the socialist states at that time, such as plastic bags, ballpoint pens, wristwatches, and nylon shirts, and which, on the other hand, were no longer interesting enough for the Viennese. He bought these things cheaply and sold them to the then still sparse tourists from the east, especially the sailors on the Danube ships. In doing so, he accepted money in Eastern Bloc currency, which had no value for the banks. He then passed this money on to people who were traveling to countries behind the Iron Curtain and took the risk of smuggling this money across. The former Hungarian refugee subsequently became very popular because word soon got around in Warsaw, Budapest, and Prague that you could buy wonderful things from D in Vienna in exchange for Eastern Bloc currency, for which you could get nothing else in the West. In this way, ED is said to have dictated the fashion on the Eastern Bloc chic. Those who held themselves up wore D-shirts, not T-shirts, but D-shirts, and cleaned them with D-washing powder. Even jokes about D appeared in the East. A traveler from Vienna asked the state travel agency in Hungary, "Excuse me, where can I find St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna?" The answer, "That's simple, comrade, just opposite D." Probably in the course of the 1960s, the main venture of such transactions became the Mexico Square. This square had been renamed in 1956 in honor of the American country because Mexico had been the only country in the world officially protesting at the League of Nations against the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany in March 1938. But back to Vienna, Gürtel was a constant observer at Mexico Square, and he provides a lively description from the 1980s. Quote, "This square in Vienna's second district on the Danube has a special ring to the people in the east, and visitors to this market are struck by the beguiling mix of cultures. Somehow this remarkable place, with all its colorfulness, reminds one of life in big ports." Kittel described the activities of one of the smugglers on Mexico Square around 1980s. Quote, "First he smuggled watches, then porn, and finally fake gold. But the smuggling of watches was particularly interesting. In 1 year, 4 million black market watches were sold at the Mexico Square. These were cheap watches from Hong Kong. They were bought here by smugglers and then shipped to the Eastern Bloc. These were the watches that the Eastern Bloc people wore. They were mostly smuggled down the Danube by boat. For the Graco racers, the Mexico Square played a major role when it came to investing the money earned through informal trade within the Eastern Bloc. VSFS reported in detail what was to be done with the proceeds from the tire sales in Hungary. Quote, "I have recently received the information that B, D, and C have a friend in Žilina, today that's in central Slovakia, where they exchange money and leave the transported tires. The transport of money takes place in the following way. B buys forints and dollars from an acquaintance in Zakopane. Then they are transported in batches to Žilina. Dollars and Czech crowns are also bought there. Next, the money was transported to Vienna, to the brother-in-law of B, where it was exchanged for shillings, that's the Austrian currency, shillings on the Mexico Square by Jews of Polish origin. With the obtained shillings, goods, textiles, were bought in large quantities and sent to Poland by various persons. Here the above-mentioned goods are sold in commissaries. The pure profit fluctuates around 50 to 60%. Unquote. Analyzing these sections, several factors are important and very typical for that time. The markets in the mountains around Zakopane, in the Carpathian Mountains, and its surroundings were virtually public, if not legal, exchange offices, as many foreign tourists went there. Jewish migrants of Polish origins were always present in Vienna on the Mexico Square, and they were also active in the gold trade. In his reports, however, Wiesław S. noted that he was cautious because an acquaintance in Vienna had told him that many of the traders on Mexico Square would cooperate with the Austrian police. I will now provide you with some preliminary conclusions from this case study. I would say that the semi-professional position of the racing drivers was hardly to overestimate. The boundaries between racing driver, technician were fluid. Many worked in private companies where informal supply practices were at the order of the day. With the rally cars, they had to take a similar approach and obtain many things themselves independently. Because of their expertise with cars and their direct contacts with Western companies, the racers were predestined to engage in informal trade in this area. Their relative freedom to travel within and outside the Eastern Bloc was additionally a great asset, and they could exploit this asset for the trading activities. This combination of various factors, which clearly distinguishes the racers from other groups, justifies, in my eyes, the theoretical approach of a subculture. Both the institutional involvement in the local automobile club and informal communication at the Café Milano and elsewhere were important to the races. The leaders in the automobile club and the better known races, such as Sobieska Zasada, covered the informal trading activities because, in all likelihood, as VSFS speculated, they received a share of the profits without exposing themselves to the risks of becoming active directly in the informal markets. The same was certainly true for representatives of state institutions, first and foremost the passport departments, but also the SB, the security services. The good networking of the racing drivers with state actors is also evident from the fact that many suspects were arrested were soon released once were soon released. They weren't really punished. This is a characteristic of the brown market, I would say, because market actors were prosecuted only half-heartedly. Many people profited from these transactions, and no one really felt directly harmed. The transactions with the car tires sold in Hungary show that in addition to trading in objects in the car sector, foreign currency operations also played a major role. Profits were soon reinvested in goods that promised an even higher profit margin, such as Western clothing purchased on Mexico Square. Therefore, Vienna was of great importance, on the one hand, due to the numerous contacts with Polster, on the other hand, due to the unique market, where it was possible to pay with Eastern currency. Finally, goods of Western provenance also played a highly symbolic role. Castrol, Castrol that was mentioned several times in this talk, may have been the best motor oil available, but it was also a past prototype for the West, whose prestige far outweighed its actual importance. This can be also seen in the various things with Castrol imprinted on them that were traded informally: jackets, calendars. I mean, they may have been of superior quality, but I think that the symbolic dimension is here really very much of significance. In the end, I will return to the question of continuity, because I mentioned the case of car trafficking from Vienna to Poland in the 1980s. So the question is there any continuity from the 1970s to the 1980s? In the case of the two racing drivers arrested in Vienna in 1987, it is clear that they made use of both their professional skills, the networks, and their experience with informal practices. Admittedly, they had now gone a step further. Now it was not just smuggling, but theft. In the 1980s, the networks of those active in the informal car market changed considerably. The racers were joined by other groups, often also with experience in informal markets, but in other areas.